Hello and welcome to Bambasbat. Today I'm joined by Patrick Ottaway. He is a Roman York expert, if I'm allowed to call you that, Patrick. I am really excited that Patrick is joining me today. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Would you mind giving us a quick rundown of your career? How did you get into archaeology?
Yes, okay. Well, look, I started in archaeology many years ago now. I started in Colchester, Roman Colchester. I went as an excavation volunteer, not really intending to have a professional career in archaeology at the time. And I was put into a site which was in the middle of the legionary fortress in Colchester, and we were excavating deposits associated with the destruction by Boudica in the year 60. And Tacitus was right. She did burn Colchester, and we had these wonderful burnt deposits all over the place. And I think I was sold from then on. I thought, this is fantastic. After Colchester, I did various other things, but I worked in a number of places around England. And then I got my first sort of professional appointment with Winchester Museum Service. And I worked as the assistant city archaeologist in Winchester for, I suppose, about 6 years. And I was basically out in the field all the time, excavating sites, Roman cemetery, and sites in the Anglo-Saxon town. And that was great. And then the opportunity came for me to move to the York Archaeological Trust. And the early 80s, I worked for York Archaeological Trust for some 25 years. And latterly, I was head of the fieldwork team and organising the excavations and reporting and so on and so forth. And then after a while, I decided that I would move on from there and became, I suppose you could call, a consultant in archaeology and heritage. And my company provides advice to public bodies, commercial developers about matters to do with archaeology and heritage, a lot to do with the planning process and how the planning process works, and how my clients work their way through the tangled web of the planning process, and also dealing with historic England over matters to do with scheduled ancient monuments. So that's it in a sort of nutshell, if you like. And along the way, I've got numerous publications, too numerous to detail, but I suppose relevant to our deliberations today is a book I wrote on Roman York, which the last edition was 2004, which is a sort of summary history of the subject. And then in 2021, I wrote a book which is entitled Julia Velva, a Roman Lady from York, Her Life and Times Revealed. Then I have many publications to do with my excavations in Winchester as well. And I wrote for Historic England, I wrote an urban archaeological assessment document for Winchester's great big book, basically, summary of Winchester's archaeology and history. But I've been very, very fortunate, really. I've excavated some wonderful sites in Winchester, first of all, and then latterly in York, and had other very important and interesting projects. So, yeah, I've had a very busy, you could say, career, and have been involved with all sorts of different things, and it's been great, really.
Yes, that's an incredible career. So I suppose you get this question a lot. What's the best thing that you think that on one of your digs has been found?
What I often think of in that regard, first of all, I excavated a Roman cemetery in Winchester, burials of the late 1st, 2nd, early 3rd century. And I think really it's not necessarily any one particular object, but it's the whole view we get of the community of people living in the Roman town at Winchester during that period. And you see the sort of different, the balance of population, men and women and children. And one of the most striking things about it was a large number of infants. It looked as though something like 40% of the people born didn't make it past about, a year, 18 months. That really puts life today in a perspective. We are so fortunate nowadays that we don't have that. And of course, that is typical of other Roman cemeteries as well. You're very high infant mortality. We also had a whole range of different sorts of artifacts, really, and you get a very good impression of the way communities have regarded the dead in the Roman period and what they thought was appropriate to put with their burials, their pots, and for the females, the mirrors and jewellery and so forth. So, yeah, I look at that. And then lastly, in York, of course, I had the opportunity to work in the Roman town on the southwest bank of the River Ouse in the early 80s. The first trench, I suppose you could say, right in the heart of what we know as the Roman town, southwest of the Ouse on Regier Street. And we went down something like 7 metres below modern ground level to the original to when the town was founded. And it's a great thrill to do that, really. No one had ever done it before. And then I excavated a very large site nearby a few years later, site we know is Wellington Row, where the Aviva Insurance Building now stands. And again, we got an insight into the development of the Roman town in a way that hadn't been possible through archaeology before. So those two projects in York and our developing knowledge, I suppose, of the Roman town in the time I've been in York has been a great thrill to me, yeah.
So York, we know very little about the actual town itself. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, on the principal urban area of Roman York, as opposed to the legionary fortress, which is on the northeast bank of the River Ouse, the Roman town there has not been extensively explored, really. When you compare York to places like Winchester or like London or Canterbury or some of the other towns in the south of England, which have been very extensively explored, we haven't had those opportunities so much in York. Gradually things are changing, and every now and again sites do come up, and we're beginning to understand now the history of the place, street layout, character of the buildings, and of course an enormous amount about the material culture, because all these sites we excavate are very rich in artifacts, not just masses of pottery but also a great range of other materials. And so a picture is gradually emerging, and it's been great to be at the beginning, in a sense, almost at the start of it, if you like. And hopefully the archaeologists of the future will take the thing on, and they'll know an awful lot more in due course.
It must be so exciting to have been on the Rudia Street dig. That must have been incredible. Why is Roman York so far below modern day York?
This is an interesting subject, really, because modern ground level is, in places anyway, close to the river at York, as much as 7 meters above the original ground level. I mean, even more in one or two places along the banks of the Foss. And the reason is to do with the fact that river levels have changed quite a considerable amount in York. We don't really realize that when you just look at the Ouse today. But the average level of the river today is at least 3 meters, if not more, higher than it would have been in the past, in Roman times. It's hard to know with the Roman period in a way, because the river was tidal then, of course, and it's a rather different sort of river altogether. But over the centuries, river level has gradually risen, and the water table has risen as well. And this is due to climate change. It's due to something called isostatic shift, which basically means that Britain's tipping over to the southeast. This is as a result of the last ice age. You see, when the ice went, then the weight came off the north part of Britain and it sort of rose up, still rising, and the southeast part dipping away. And also the river has been confined within a much more narrow course than it was hitherto. And then as time has gone on, occupation material has accumulated in the river valleys. So buildings one after another, people dumping rubbish, silt and so forth, washing down. And so gradually the ground level rises, and sometimes people are deliberately raising the level in order to get ground level out of the wetland. And so you get in river corridors this great depth of archaeological remains. Not so much the case if you go around York Minster. It's not so deep. I mean, it's maybe 2 to 3 meters, but it's not as much. But it's to do with the fact there have been people here for 2,000 years, doing things.
And Julia Velva would have been here, well, nearly 2,000 years ago, I suppose, in the 2nd century.
Yes, Julia Velva is my favourite. She has a tombstone now to be seen in the Yorkshire Museum. This was found on the Mount it's about 100 years ago, I suppose. And she would have been alive around about somewhere between about 160 AD and 210, something of that order. She was 50 years when she died, according to her inscription. So within that late 2nd, early 3rd century time frame. And she was here at a very important time in the history of Roman York, really, because this was a time when York was a major army centre, military centre, the legionary fortress, as we understand it, was in full garrison, more or less. That the army had come back from Hadrian's Wall, and they were ensconced in the fortress, building things and doing all the other things that soldiers do. And the town was growing very rapidly. And one can imagine that people were coming into York from all over the north of England, new people coming to settle here. But not only that, but they were coming from all over the Roman Empire as well. And we know this from the burials, we know this from examination of human remains, that we have a population which is very diverse. If you walked up and down the streets of Roman York in around about the year 200, you'd have met people from all over the Roman Empire. It's a sort of cosmopolitan place which really has no equal in Roman Britain, apart from London, I would say. So yes, she, quite whether she's a native in origin or whether she is someone who has a heritage elsewhere in the empire, we don't know. Unfortunately, we don't have her actual burial, we just have her tombstone. But she is obviously from the elite. She's from the upper echelons of Roman society. And the whole point of her tombstone is for her family to show off that they are in the top rank of Roman society. And this tombstone plonked up on top of the mount is a advertisement for themselves, if you like. So anybody coming into York along the main road from the southwest will see it and they'll say, yes, here is one of the families to be reckoned with in this place. So she's in the top rank of local society. And she's shown on her tombstone with a man who's Aurelius Mercurialis, who we presume is her husband, although it doesn't actually say that. And Roman tombstones are sometimes a little enigmatic on these matters, but we presume that he is her husband, and he certainly describes himself as her heir. So he is someone who presumably put the tombstone in place. There are two other figures on the tombstone as well. There's a girl who may represent family, and a man who is probably a servant. One of the points of these tombstones is to advertise, their family statements. This is us. This is our dynasty. We are important people. We are going forward into the years to come, and our family will live and flourish in this place, and we will rule forever, sort of thing. But it's one of the best tombstones from Roman Britain. When I first came to York, I did some evening classes. A man in my evening class, an elderly gentleman, was there when the tombstone was found. He was a small boy, and he remembers it actually being found. So I've had a sort of connection with it ever since, really. And I take people to the Yorkshire Museum, and I've stood them in front of Julia Velva's tombstone many, many times, and I've talked about it. And so, as I say, it's my favourite thing from Roman Britain. She is my favourite Roman, yeah.
I'm so glad you mentioned the story of the man from your class, because that was such a heartwarming part of the book. When I read that in your book, I was like, I'm so glad there's a real connection between you and the tombstone. In a way, you can trace it back.
That's right.
I love that. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, and I thought we see that I could use that tombstone as a starting point for all sorts of stories about Roman York. There's so many things you can take that tombstone as a starting point. Talk about society, or you can talk about quarrying these stones, the use of stone. You can talk about dress. You can talk about hairstyles, fashion. And I thought, well, we know so much about York in the 2nd century, early 3rd century, so much from archaeology primarily, more than we know about York in any other comparable period until we get to the sort of late Viking Age, really. And so I wanted to sort of concentrate on that period and talk about York in that particular period. The Julia Velva period, I sometimes call it.
Yeah, I like that a lot, the Julia Velva period. So her tombstone was on top of the mount. Was that outside of the settlement?
Yes, I mean, Roman burials are always outside the settled areas. The Romans are very strict about that. Usually, so you get the places like York, which are surrounded by their cemeteries. The cities of the dead and the cities of the living are kept rigidly apart. That's right.
But there were some infant burials inside the city.
You do find infants sometimes in under the floors of houses and even in the legionary fortress. And I think the thing was that they weren't considered sort of fully, as it were, human until they got past a certain age. And it goes back to my comment earlier about the infants in Winchester. Because infant mortality is so high, I think that infants were treated rather less, as it were. Well, people didn't expect their children to live in quite the way we do now. So they weren't, perhaps until they'd reached about 18 months or so, they weren't really considered fully human. So that explains why it was sometimes acceptable, it seems, to bury infants within buildings.
Yeah, they don't have the same sort of pollution as an adult would.
That's right.
So you said that you really like how Julia Velva's tombstone can be used to talk about so many different things. In terms of sort of what we know about Roman women, is it a good piece of evidence, or would you say we have to use other pieces of evidence to help us with Julia Velva's tombstone?
The whole matter of, as it were, the visibility of women compared to men in the Roman world is something which is an interesting subject, really. But here we have an elite woman, and you see her. She's reclining on a couch, I suppose you call it, or a bed. And the scene that we see there in sort of summary form is a dining scene. It's, you're in the dining room of an elite Roman house in York, and people recline to dine, or adults recline to dine, and their servants brought them their food, and they chatted amongst themselves, and they had formal entertainments of one sort or another, musicians perhaps, or dancers, or whatever. And so that's what we're seeing there. And again, it's a statement about status, that these are people who have a Roman house, probably of some, of Mediterranean style, in which you have the triclinium, the Roman dining room. And that's where we see Julia Velva. And you could interpret this as a sort of funeral meal, if you like, I suppose. She's sort of, as it were, being seen off into the next world. She is, we don't see her whole body, but we do see her head, and she has a very fine hairstyle in a style which was common in the early 3rd century. The emperors and empresses were very much the determinants of fashion amongst the provincials, and Julia Velva's hairstyle is the sort of thing that you would see, for example, Julia Domna, who's the wife of Septimius Severus, that her sort of hairstyle parting down the middle and then waved on either side, and her hair then drawn back into a sort of chignon or bun at the back. So then some of the other tombstones from Roman York also show female images. And we have quite a few from York, actually, relative to most parts of Roman Britain, which in a sense is not saying much. But I think I'm right in saying there's something like 7 or 8 images of female citizens in York, which is more than most people have. So, yes, we see the dress of the period and the hairstyle. We get an impression of how these people carried themselves, how they wished to have themselves portrayed to the outside world.
And her husband or heir, whoever that man is, Aurelius Mercurialis, do we know anything about him?
Not really, no. I mean, his name is interesting because, Roman names are, as you probably realise, they don't work in quite the same way as ours do. In other words, what is in effect the sort of surname becomes before the given name. So he would have been known to his chums as Mercurialis, and his family name is Aurelius. People who had achieved citizenship in the early 3rd century is extended in the early 3rd century to all freeborn members of the empire, that is to say, everyone who wasn't a slave. In gratitude, as it were, to the emperor Caracalla, who was responsible for this, people took his family name. They had to have a family name, so they took the emperor's in gratitude, as it were, for receiving their citizenship. So there are lots of Aureliuses and Aurelias in Roman Britain, and it's probably the case that most of them are people or the descendants of people who achieved citizenship at this great distribution of the citizenship right in the early 3rd century. Aurelius Mercurialis, he may have been a soldier, I suppose, quite likely in York, or he may have been a merchant, but I think he's a man of status, and he's rather pleased to show off the fact that he's Aurelius, really, in a way. It's something that gives him a bit of status. He is shown on the tombstone. His hairstyle is quite interesting, really. It's rather similar to some of the early 3rd century emperors, with a kind of peak at the front. He wears a natty sort of cloak, a very similar sort of style to cloaks seen elsewhere in the empire and the Rhineland, for example. But again, it would be interesting to know what his regional origin was. Many of the people we know in Roman York did come from the Rhineland or had Rhineland heritage due to military connections, I suppose.
And that's something that's really fascinating about Eboracum, in that we have so many different people from the empire, it seems, from some of the burials.
Yeah, we have them on the they're referred to on the tombstones as well. There are a few tombstones which refer to people who come from parts of Gaul. But what's really sort of changed the whole picture, really, is the sort of scientific examination we can now do of human remains, looking at DNA and looking also at the minerals, the isotopes of the minerals that are to be found in teeth. And people who are expert on these things can tell us a good deal about the likely regional origins of the people of Roman York, and quite a lot of work's been done on these of skeletons in York now. They come from all over. They come from hot countries. There's people who might well be from sort of North Africa or what's now the Middle East, as well as people from colder climates. different parts of Britain perhaps, and also from outside the empire in Northern Europe, in Germany, Scandinavia even.
Wow.
And they're coming here because these are soldiers. Some of them are obviously soldiers. The men are soldiers, maybe, or they may be merchants who are coming here because, a legionary fortress provides all sorts of opportunity for business. And so, as I said before, if you'd walked up and down the street in Roman York, you'd have met people from all sorts of different parts of the world. And they probably spoke a variety of languages as well. I mean, we think of people speaking Latin and probably a good deal of Greek as well, but maybe other languages too, including the native Celtic tongue, although we know very little about that.
And Julia Velva may have been a native.
Yeah, I mean, her family name, she has the Julian family name, which of course goes back to Julius Caesar, if you like. And it may be that some forebear of hers received citizenship during the time of Julius Caesar. She was a citizen, but whether she is a native girl who happens to have been brought up in a family which also has heritage in other part, in some other part of the empire in Italy itself, it's hard to say. Velva is thought by people who study naming to be a Celtic-derived name. So it may be that she has acquired that name because she is a native. On the other hand, people coming to Britain may have named their children after using local names. I mean, we do the same sort of thing today, really. We're fairly sort of diverse in the way we choose names. And so it's rather hard to tell. But I would like to think she was a native to Britain, and she's a York girl. She's a proto-Yorkshire woman, if you like.
I hope she is too. On her tombstone, you mentioned that there are some sort of puns or jokes, patterns on her tombstone. Is that common? Could you just tell us what they are first?
Yes. Now, here you're getting me onto a subject which I'm very interested in, actually, because the inscription on the tombstone is in the usual way of Roman tombstones, abbreviated. Mm-hmm. But we are told that she is Julia Velva. She's very, very pious, very devout. And this is a sort of stock, if you like, a stock expression that men put on their tombstones to show what wonderful women their wives were. Piantissima, she's called. And then we're told that she's died aged 50 years and that the tombstone was set up by Aurelius Mercurialis. But it's abbreviated in such a way that there are 81 letters in the inscription. Now, that excludes the DM, which the whole thing begins with, which is a sort of standard thing for Dies Manibus, a dedication to the spirits of the dead. So if you take that out, you get 81 letters. There are letters which are sort of two merged into one, if you like. It's quite a common Roman thing, but if you count those as one, you get 81 letters. And that's 9 squared, 9 by 9. And then we have 16 words, 4 squared, and Julia Velva's initial letter I occurs 16 times, so 4 squared again. And then you've got 4 figures on the tombstone. So it's quite unusual to have a tombstone which depicts 4 people. Normally 1 or 2, but occasionally you get more than that. But here we have 4 people. And you put her initials together, IV, and then, of course, that's 4, isn't it? So I think what this is, it's an example of a convention, if you like, in Roman inscriptions, which I have detected on other tombstones in York, where you get these numeric patterns. They're very interested, obviously, in square numbers, and whether it's in terms of letters or in terms of words. And you do rather wonder why they're doing it in a way. But I think what happens is, you see, that if you commission a tombstone and you want to have an inscription on it, then you go along to somebody who put it together for you, and get the words together, make it fit on the tombstone, all those things, and get the message that you want across. Whether you want to say somebody is, your wife very devout or whatever, or you want to give people's age, or you want to give their origins or whatever. There's a certain level of information that is usually provided in some way or other, and then the scribe or whatever, how you describe him, puts the thing together, and it seems that in doing that, they observe, as I say, certain conventions about the way the words are abbreviated and the letters are organized in such a way as to create these numeric patterns. I've found this on quite a few of the tombstones of Roman York, and I find it absolutely fascinating. Nobody seems to have recorded this before, as far as I can tell. I keep meaning to I keep meaning to write about this in detail, but I haven't really got round to it. But people can do it for themselves. You can go into the Yorkshire Museum and look at the inscriptions and do some counting. It's a simple thing, really. There's a coffin dedicated to a lady called Julia Fortunata in the Yorkshire Museum. Lucky Julia, I call her. And her inscription has got numeric patterns in it as well, in terms of words and in terms of letters. And it's something I think which I've seen in other parts of Roman Britain as well, although I've not studied in detail in other parts of Roman Britain. But certainly there are examples in Chester and in some of the settlements on Hadrian's Wall of a similar sort of thing. And I think it is an established convention in the late 2nd, early 3rd century that these numeric patterns are introduced into the tombstones. And why they're doing it is hard to know. One thought that occurred to me was that it creates something which is harmonious. It creates sort of an impression of harmony, if you like. And what people want to do is they want to appeal to the gods. It's almost like an imitation of the divine in a way, an imitation of divine harmony, of divine balance. This is something which has a spiritual value, I think.
I really hope somewhere there's the spirit of a Roman stonemason just really pleased that someone's noticed.
Yes, that's right. Well, I've never seen any literature on the subject anywhere, and it seems such an obvious thing in a way. All you got to do is count.
Yeah. So these stonemasons, would they be very educated? You mentioned something about them knowing good arithmetic, and they'd be some of the upper classes of Roman elite in York.
I think what you have is a class of literate men, probably all men, I should imagine, who were scribes, if you like, and they would write out the inscription, and then this would be handed over to the guys with the chisels, who then actually formed the letters. I think that this is probably a two-stage process. I suspect that the actual masons themselves were not necessarily literate, and that may account for some errors that sometimes you get in inscriptions.
Right.
But in York, they were certainly, at the time we're talking about, the late 2nd, early 3rd century, they're very skilled, these masons. I mean, the letters are beautifully formed. And for example, on Julia Velva's tombstone, it's high quality work.
Other trades in York, what sort of things would they be? What would they be doing? What would they be selling?
Yes, well, York is an urban place where you have a whole range of trades and crafts, if you like. People making things. We know metalwork, one sort or another. The excavations which took place in Regent Street, Tanner Row in the early 1980s, where we found Roman timber buildings. There was certainly metalwork going on in that area, lots of debris from metalworking there. And you would find manufacture of pottery as well as ceramics. We know of kilns which were primarily used by the military, or under the supervision of the military anyway, over in the Peasholm Green area of York. And I've no doubt that you have a full range of manufacturing going on, textiles, leather, shoes, saddles, all sorts of leather goods. And we find the examples of what people made, of course. We don't always find the places that they actually made them. That's rather more difficult to determine. And then at the same time, of course, the economy is flourishing because it's trade by trade. And we can plot the patterns of trade into Roman York through pottery. Pottery is wonderful stuff, really. We get lots of it. It's more or less indestructible. And we know an enormous amount about pottery now. Pottery is distinctive to its locality in terms of its shape and form and in terms of the clay. So we can say that, yes, that York is a centre for trade in pottery coming from Gaul in the form of the sort of red shiny stuff, the Samian ware, other forms of pottery as well from the Mediterranean world, and of course from all over Britain as well, and from the Rhineland. But you see, the pottery is an indication of other things being traded. Not everything survives in the ground, but the ships coming into York with pottery, no doubt were bringing other things as well, bringing textiles, for example. We have one or two little bits of silk from Roman York. This comes probably from the Near East. And then we know that wine was coming here, olive oil as well. We have the vessels, the amphorae, these great jars, which were produced in the south coast of Spain, and then the Rhineland amphorae, which bring the wine. And so the pottery is a great guide to trading patterns, and it shows you that York is a great entrepot, if you like, of material being brought in from all over the empire, really. And initially, primarily, of course, I suppose you could say it's to supply the soldiers. The legionaries are guys who, they demand the best, and they want their wine, and they want their olive oil, and no doubt they want their other luxury goods as well. And then, of course, you've got the governing classes in York as well. You've got the provincial governor, and in the early 3rd century, when York becomes the capital of a province, then he and his staff, again, wealthy people who demand luxuries from all over the empire.
So it becomes a little bit of a hub in the north of Britain for trade.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, indeed.
Do they send anything out that's made in York or Yorkshire?
Now, that's an interesting question. Of course, in a sense, what did we export? Well, I think I would suggest that York is a centre for the export of agricultural products. Britain is known as a place which supplied grain to the rest of the empire. I think that probably York was a collecting point for grain, which was grown in the fertile Vale of York. And we had a very nice piece of evidence for this in the trench in Regis Street that I referred to earlier on. We had a great big thick deposit of burnt grain. And this was probably a debris from a fire in a warehouse on the river bank, a granary which had burnt down. And so we had this great big deposit of grain, and I think that it had been intended probably for export. It was going to go in a ship, and it was going to be taken to the Rhineland or to Gaul or whatever. And this was primarily wheat, and that is to say spelt wheat, which was the principal type of wheat available in Roman times, but a certain amount of barley as well, and rye also in there. So I think that certainly one of the exports from York is agricultural products.
So going back to Julia Velva, if you don't mind, I know you like talking about Julia Velva. How would she spend her time? Can we infer anything if she was a high-class woman?
How did she spend her time? Well, look, these ladies who are sort of in the upper classes of Roman Britain, they are not constrained to work. Their time is their own, if you like. They have an army of slaves to do the cooking and to look after the children, and to take care of the day-to-day running of their households. And I would think that Julia Velva spent a certain amount of time at the baths. This was popular with not just men but women as well, and there were sort of women's hours, women's times when they could use the baths. And we know of a great bathhouse which was excavated on Micklegate, the sort of bottom end of Micklegate. I think that probably that she would have gone there with her friends and chums, and spent time there. She may have been, who knows what else she did. Was she a gardener? Maybe she was keen on gardening. I don't know. But
in her big estate.
Or maybe she had intellectual interests and spent her time reading or engaging in sort of philosophical discussion with other people. The sort of dinner parties of Roman York, where they had their sort of equivalent of the symposium, if you like, and perhaps she participated actively in those discussions. I mean, I think that often the problem is it's difficult to know what women's intellectual interests were, really, because we know a lot about what men were interested in because they wrote about it, whereas women didn't, or they weren't able to write about their intellectual interests by and large. It's interesting to speculate. What did she do with her time? I mean, to some extent, she was a wife and mother, but as I say, she had other people to do the sort of the household chores.
Yes, and on her tombstone there is a servant. Is that normal?
There is, yeah, that's right. It's very interesting, actually, because he is shown small. And on Roman inscriptions, inferior people, servants, were shown small. They were, little, show that they were unimportant, relatively speaking.
So she would have been a wealthy woman who owned lots of servants or slaves? Yes,
I imagine her husband would have been a man with property, yes, certainly, and so they had a staff of slaves. And also freed slaves as well. Slaves could achieve by their freedom, and having become freed men and women, they often stayed with their original patrons and continued to work for them in various capacities.
Right. Okay.
I mean, there's a great house. You see, one of the excavations done in York was at Bishop Hill, on the southwest bank of the river, in an area which I think is probably residential. And there was a large house excavated there, of the sort which Julia Velva would have lived in, I think, where not only she and her husband would live and their immediate family, but also their servants and their freedmen and their sort of general hangers-on would live as well. These were large, some of these houses were very large establishments, which were capable of accommodating, 20 people or more.
So like in your final chapter, you talk about all the things she could have been. She could have been very kind, and she could have been very, very snobbish. And I thought that was very good, all this discussion of who she might have been.
Yes. I mean, I think one thing that I think is quite interesting is that she lived to be 50 years of age. And that's not bad for the Roman period. And I think it's quite likely that she would have had more than one husband. And girls were married, you see, often very young. And so she might have initially been married probably to a rather older man, perhaps when she was 12, 13, something like that. And so over a period of 30 or more years, it's quite likely that she was seen off at least one husband, probably maybe one or two.
Yes.
And I think that's quite an interesting thing to think about.
So we found this large house on Bishop Hill, found some Roman baths, we found the garrison headquarters. If there's one building we could find that you think is missing from York, what would it be, or you wish you could find?
Yes, interesting question. I mean, I think that it would be very interesting to find the Forum. I mean, somewhere there is the the great civic centre which all Roman towns had. There are intriguing hints that this was located in the area which would in fact have been close to the main Roman road to York from the southwest as it comes up to a river bridge. Now, we found this road when we were excavating on the Wellington Row site, and we know where the bridge was. It went across and would have landed at what's now the York Guildhall. So I think that the Forum is quite likely to be near there on the southwest bank of the river, and there are some intriguing hints that it may be there. There's an inscription, an inscribed stone from there, which refers to the spirit of Eboracum, and it's the sort of thing that you'd find in a Forum building. So, I mean, that would be great to find that and to locate that. And this would be a very big building. I mean, this is a large courtyard surrounded by buildings on all four sides, including on one side the Great Basilica, the Great Hall, which would have been something rather similar to the great headquarters building we know about in the Legionary Fortress.
It'd be amazing to find that.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to knock a few
buildings down.
We've got to knock a few 19th century buildings down
who
first.
Needs those? Who needs those? Get to Roman York.
Yeah.
Yeah. So over your career, what's been the biggest thing you think's changed in archaeology?
Oh, goodness me.
It's a big question.
That's a difficult question. I think that archaeology is, I think archaeology is we're much more professional now. It's a much better organised profession than it was. When I started, it was sort of rather freewheeling sort of occupation, and one went from place to place, taking the work as it came. Then, I mean, I was fortunate to get a professional engagement with a local authority in Winchester, but a lot of archaeologists worked very much sort of hand to mouth in a way with temporary contracts with the then Department of Environment or whatever it was. In terms of professional standards, it was very, very variable. I mean, and we're much better at recording things now. We are much better. We know an awful lot more about scientific techniques, and also we are much more professional in just the way that we're organised. I mean, archaeology now is dominated, I suppose you could say, by a number of large companies. Some of them have a sort of regional remit, others work all over England and beyond. They look after their staff a lot better than is the case hitherto. They have a health and safety culture which we never really had, and when I started, we have a professional institute now. We have the Chartered Institute for Field Archaeology, which most professional archaeologists belong to, which maintains standards in terms of not just sort of employment and and health and safety, but also in terms of the way we treat clients, we relate to clients, and provide services to them. So I think that starting out in archaeology today, you're going to be joining a much better organised profession than the profession that I joined when I started.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Patrick, so much for this wonderful rundown of Roman, well, Britain, but specifically Roman York and Julia Velva. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Well, Roman York is a fascinating subject, and I think that I feel very privileged to have been involved in the study of the subject, and I look forward to many great excavations still to come.
Absolutely, me too.
I should just say, I suppose, that the York Archaeological Trust has just published a volume which is a report on a Roman cemetery which was excavated at Hungate, that is to say, on the northeast bank of the river. Now, this was not anything directly to do with me, but it is an important contribution to knowledge. And there are some very interesting burials which are described in that volume, some of which have very rich grave finds, notably of jet objects. Jet is very much a York thing. Jet comes from Whitby, and jet was worked in York into jewellery items of one sort or another. And so there's some wonderful jewellery from this particular site, and it's a very important contribution to knowledge.
Yes, you talk about Jet in the book Julia Velva, a Roman lady in York, and I thought that was really fascinating that Jet was such a big part of York.
That's right. Yes. We are a centre for jet production, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That's all we have time for on the podcast today. I will see you next time on Bambasbat.